Good evening and welcome to WPSU's Vote 18. Over the next 3 weeks, we'll talk with the candidates running for the U.S. House to represent Pennsylvania's 12th, 13th, and 15th congressional districts. Today, the focus is on the 12th district. Two candidates are vying for the position, Republican Tom Marino, the incumbent, and Democrat Marc Friedenberg. We'll be hearing from both candidates, beginning with Marc Friedenberg. Welcome to WPSU's Vote 18 Race for the 12th District. Today we're talking with Democrat Marc Friedenberg, the challenger in Pennsylvania's new 12th Congressional District. Friedenberg is a faculty member in Penn State's College of Information Sciences and Technology. Before that, he practiced intellectual property and securities law in New York. Friedenberg got involved in politics after coming out in defense of the Affordable Care Act. Marc Friedenberg, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Part of your platform is supporting the Affordable Care Act, and you've said that health care is a right that everyone should have, and you want to fight to include that in Medicare.
That's right.
Do you think that that is politically feasible, given how difficult it was to even pass the Affordable Care Act?
I do. I see a lot of support for Medicare for All. Medicare for All is a single-payer program, basically expanding the program that we already have and that most Americans who are on it really enjoy. The Medicare program has 3% overhead versus 31% for private insurance, which a lot of that is profit and administration costs. Many people understand what kind of return they get on that. The dollar spent on Medicare is a lot more efficiently spent than a dollar on private insurance. And on top of that, employers support it too, because rather than them directly contributing to their employees' healthcare costs, that's something that would be paid for by tax in a different way. Divorcing the relationship between employment and healthcare, I think, is really important and will help to revitalize the economy and enable people to move to the jobs that best suit them, rather than being worried about moving and losing their health care, or getting sick, losing their job, and then losing health care, which happens all too often.
Even though there are those benefits, there is still a lot of opposition to it, and there are concerns that it could lead to a tax increase, or that in the end it could mean less control over your health care. How do you address those? If you were elected, how would you go about that?
You know, I think it's, obviously there are important questions to be asked, but I think that the right question is, can we even afford our healthcare system today, let alone in 10 years? Most of the estimates are that we're actually going to be spending far less overall on healthcare under Medicare for All, again, because of that lower overhead. It would involve a tax, that's true, and I don't think that needs to be a dirty word. The take-home pay for most employees is going to be higher, again, because that deduction won't be there. We will have a system that provides health care for everybody. And it's important to note this is different than some other European models where the government is the one directly providing the health care. Here, this is just about payments. So doctors and mental health providers and dentists and so on, they'll be the ones making decisions about the care that patients receive. You
also support raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour.
I do.
What would you say to the counter-argument that the economy is booming, unemployment in Pennsylvania is at an 18-year low, and you have companies who are stepping up and raising their minimum wage voluntarily, Amazon, for example?
Yeah, I think Amazon is, I don't like to be in the position of relying on Jeff Bezos' largesse, but I think it's actually a good example that the market can support that. If you look at the unemployment rate in Pennsylvania getting historically low, that's wonderful, nobody can deny that. But wages for people at that minimum wage are often stagnant. I think that Amazon recognizes where the puck is going and they want to be there. I think that if anybody accepts the logic of the minimum wage, which almost every American does, having it $7.25 now is a disgrace. It's so far below what inflation and the cost of living increases would be. A lot of estimates are that it really ought to be around $22 an hour. I think 15 is a statement that if you put in a fair day's work, you should get a fair day's pay.
There's also the argument that the cost of living varies from place to place, even within the 12th district.
It does.
How would you address that?
You know, I think that, the cost of living does vary, but we've adopted a federal minimum wage in the past. We've adopted a state minimum wage. In Pennsylvania, it happens to be the federal. But having those differences in wages is an important way to compete. All of the states surrounding Pennsylvania have raised their minimum wage above the federal floor. They've all seen lower unemployment and higher wages across the board, which I think is a really important thing. If somebody's dollar can go a little bit further in a more rural district, I think that's great for them. I want to make sure that the economy in our rural communities is strong as well.
The 12th Congressional District stretches from the New York border all the way down to outside of Harrisburg, and it's considered considered one of the reddest districts in the state of Pennsylvania. You're someone who opposed President Donald Trump. Do you think that you were a good fit for the district?
Yeah, I think that this district is, if you look at voter registration numbers, that does give you one sense of it. Overall, though, it's a non-voting district, really, and that's one of the main things that I'm trying to counter in this campaign, is to get people to understand that their vote is so important. Having people realize that the things that President Trump campaigned on that I do support, like $1.5 trillion for infrastructure spending, better, cheaper health care for everybody, this Congress has not been able to deliver them. I think this is a district that's really populist. This is not a very rich district. This is not a district that fares very well on a lot of different rankings with regard to healthcare, with regard to education, with regard to income. I think this is a district of people who could use some help from the government, being able to get that equality of opportunity that people in Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, let alone New York or Los Angeles, can try to get. We had Chris Carney, a Democrat, representing, this district is new, but the 10th from 2006 to 2010, coming in a wave year. I think there's pretty clear evidence that people will vote for their best interest when they have a clear choice.
You've been very critical of the incumbent Republican Representative Tom Marino, but he won the last election pretty handily. And even though he faced a Republican opponent in the primary, he won that hands down as well. Do you really think that your odds are that you could win?
Absolutely. I don't even think of Tom Marino as the incumbent. We've got a third of this district, the voters, don't have Tom Marino as their incumbent. Center County is a big part of that, Clinton County. And I think that for so many people, they're going to take a look at his record, take a look at his involvement with the opioid crisis, and see that he's not really there to represent their interests. And I think that, we have a campaign office, 240 West Hamilton Avenue. We have people coming in every single day to vent about whatever's in the news, a lot of that, and then we put them to work. And if you see the level of energy, the level of enthusiasm, how much time people are committing to this campaign, it's humbling for me, but it also makes me more eager than ever to get out there and deliver a win for them.
One of your big criticisms of the incumbent, Tom Marino, has been legislation that he initially sponsored that many people say makes it harder for the Drug Enforcement Agency to intervene for suspicious shipments of opioids.
The DA itself said that, yes.
If you were elected, what would you do?
Well, I think we need to unwind that legislation. That's a start, and there's already been a bill introduced to do that. I think with regard to the opioid crisis more generally, we need to have a more sympathetic view, try to take away the stigma around addiction, because I think for a lot of people, stigma, the feeling that, oh, it's a moral failure on my part, it's a weakness on my part, keeps them from getting the help that they need, whether it's medication or mental health treatment, and it keeps their family members and their loved ones from seeking out that treatment for them. So I think that it's an attitude change that we need. I think we need to understand that medication-assisted treatments are an effective tool, and they're medically proven to be so. And I think we need to make sure that we hold companies like Purdue Pharma that have contributed to this by lying to doctors about the habit-forming nature of their medications are held to account as well. And that's why I'm really glad to see the various lawsuits from state attorneys general and so on that are being brought against those companies.
Do you think that's the most effective way of holding them accountable?
I do. I'm a big believer in the courts, and so for things that have happened in the past, I think that's a good fit for the courts. For things in the future, that's where Congress can play an effective role.
There recently was bipartisan legislation attempting to deal with the opioid epidemic, and it introduces some new things, including funding more treatment options, changes to regulation, better tracking. It sounds like you're saying that's not enough, though.
I think those are all really, really important steps, absolutely, but it's almost a matter of education. I think it's just the way that we think about addiction needs to change. There are a lot of people who still think of it as somebody who got a prescription from a doctor and happened to become addicted, that is a failing of that person. And I think that's just not the right way to think about it. It's a disease or a sickness like any other, and we should treat it as the public health crisis that it is.
It's one thing to be critical of the incumbent from the outside, but it's another thing when you're in the office and you're the one trying to get things done. How can the voters out there know that if you were elected, you would be able to work across the aisle and take practical steps to get things done?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to look at records, right? Now, this is my first campaign, so I don't have a record of elected office to point to, but you can look at, I think that I've always fought for the little guy or the person who's been wronged in my career. It was true in the legal career. We were suing the banks that caused the crisis. In my work now for teaching, we're trying to do some, I think, really important things, like make sure that we can train students who are going to be able to protect America's cyber infrastructure, protect our utility grid, protect our electoral systems. If you look at where somebody's getting paid, I think that's a pretty important thing, or where their campaign contributions are coming from, more importantly. I know I've pledged to never take a dime from corporate PAC money. My opponent, Tom Marino, seems to be, he only takes corporate PAC money. I think that's a really effective way to make sure that you're accountable to the people who voted for you, or it does take some money to run a campaign, who supported you financially, and not to donors from outside the district who are overwhelmingly corporate interests.
Are there any specific projects that you did, either as an attorney or as a faculty member, that you think show that you can get results?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think really the way that I got started in politics was this town hall that I organized last year in the Forum building at Penn State. And I'm somebody who's, this was a week before. It was a time where there was a lot of pressure nationally for every congressman and woman to have a town hall, a forum of some kind. And it was pretty clear that our congressman wasn't willing to do it, so I stepped up and did it myself. I got one together and organized it. I think the transparency that I'm doing throughout this campaign, having open town halls, I'd like to give out my phone number. It's 814-409-7470. Give me a call and I'll talk to anybody. This is a campaign that's powered by me as a teacher, as a dad who's really worried about the future of this country, by a lot of volunteers who have been helping out. And if people like that, then I think that this is a campaign they should support.
WPSU asked our listeners and viewers for questions, and we got this question from Sherry in Newport, which is now part of the 12th District. And Sherry wants to know, would you support completely eliminating the current cap on Social Security so that all Americans pay Social Security on 100% of their income? Of course, now there is an income cap on what part of your income you pay.
Yes, I do, because the current system now with the cap, slightly under $120,000, is regressive. It takes a higher chunk from people who earn less. And I think that is a way we can really guarantee the solvency of Social Security going forward by lifting that cap.
What about the counter argument that if the cap is at $128,000 or in that ballpark, when you get benefits, you are getting the benefits for that amount. So if you're paying on more of your income, you're not getting more benefits.
You know, I think there are a lot of things that we as Americans contribute to that we don't exactly take from in equal measure and in equal proportion to what we put into it. I think if you're a believer in the fundamentals of this democracy, if you're a believer in the importance of the shared common good, I think that's an argument that, you know, even most wealthier Americans that I talk to who would be negatively impacted on a narrow basis by that lifting of the cap support it.
You said you think the American government can do more for its people.
Must do.
If you had to pick a priority, if you were elected and you had to pick one area that you were going to focus on, what would it be?
It's got to be health care. I mean, we have 30% of the adults in this district have debt that's in collection, most of it medical debt. For the bankruptcies in this district, 2/3 of them are because of medical debt. I think it is, first, a moral failure because we need to take care of each other. Going into the emergency room is not enough if you have, say, a chronic condition. And it's really holding our economy back, too, again, because we have this weird link between employment and health care that is keeping people from moving to the jobs that are the best fit for them. And when I see movement, I think the Affordable Care Act was absolutely a step in the right direction. And you saw in 2017 when the House voted to essentially repeal the ACA with no alternative in mind, that they weren't caring about the people in this district. They weren't caring about working Americans. They weren't caring about, we talk about it being about the ACA, a lot of that was just about hundreds of billions of dollars of Medicaid that was going to be cut. That wasn't for anybody but the donor class. I
think the counter argument would be that the ACA forces people to pay for health care who might not have that money to buy insurance, and that they shouldn't be forced into that.
Yeah, you know, I'm glad you bring that up, because the ACA is a complicated scheme with the requirement to have health insurance, the protection for pre-existing conditions, and then subsidies for people who need additional help to be able to pay for the plans. And what this Congress is doing now, and what there's a lawsuit from states' attorneys general are trying to do, is to take off some of those legs of the stool so that the whole thing is going to collapse. And that is a failing of the ACA, as is the platform of it being on the for-profit insurance system, I think. But it's a lot more important, I think, to look at it globally to say what is it that we can do to make sure that everybody has coverage.
The new district that you're in includes Penn State University, includes Mansfield, Lock Haven University. What role, if any, do you think the federal government should have in reducing the cost of education?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I have some experience with as a Penn State graduate and as a current Penn State faculty member. And I can tell you, I mean, I see students who are working 40 hours a week, sometimes outside of class, and you can tell that they're not giving it their all. They're not really able to in the class because they're spending so much time working, trying to pay for Penn State. And I see so many students too who come back from, years later, they're coming back recruiting, and they're still paying off those debts. And I think the federal government has an important role to play here because we're all better off when we're educated, whether that be at university or some kind of career and technical education. And it is, first of all, for this district in particular, having federal money come in is a good thing, right? I'm here to deliver the goods for the 12th district. But on top of that, it also makes it such that people will want to stay here. I think it helps the economy locally, but it also means hopefully that when students graduate, if they came to central Pennsylvania, maybe they'll want to stay here. Maybe they like it here and can continue to contribute to the economy in that way. So I'm supporting at least 50% per year, the federal government paying co-sharing the tuition with students as long as they stay in each year.
And would there be any other parameters for that? Because it sounds like some people say that's a free gift. Does the student have to have a certain GPA, or do they have to go to certain universities, low-cost universities?
I think as long as the university is willing to let them stay, that's the decision for the university. But it is the best bang for the buck. It's true for K-12, and I think it's true for higher education as well. A dollar on education is one of the best dollars that we can spend.
Would you support putting any type of pressure on universities to bring their costs down too?
You know, I don't. I have some. I have a little bit of an insight onto some of the things that happen in university politics as well. There is probably some administrative bloat that you could point to, but I think that there is, as a faculty member myself, I can tell you that we're overwhelmingly, we work really, really hard. We do okay, and so we can't really complain there, but nobody is getting particularly rich in this line of work. You do it because you love it. I took a big pay cut from New York lawyer to teach at Penn State because I really like it. And I wouldn't want to put pressure on the universities. I think we still have the market deciding, because students are going to be paying a high percentage of it. They'll decide where the best, where the best use of their money is.
Even among those who've been critical of President Trump, there are some who support him taking a tougher stance with China on trade. Do you think that that's a good position to take?
I guess it depends what tougher is. I think these tariffs are a disastrous idea. They are attacks on the American consumer. They are holding back our economy by picking winners and losers, which is the exact opposite, I think, of what most conservative economists have talked about for decades, picking winners and losers, free trade being good for us. And I teach a globalization class this semester, and students are having a hard time even understanding why would a country do this to itself. The United States is doing this to itself. We are further isolating ourselves from the rest of the world. Economically, we're doing it by withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, from the Iran deal, by calling into question our NATO obligations. The U.S. is withdrawing from the world, and that's going to have grave consequences. I'm very worried about the state of our institutions, the global institutions, U.S. institutions. I think today we're having we're seeing the Supreme Court and the Senate legitimacy being called into some question, ongoing attacks on the press. But to the basic question about China, no, I don't think it's a good idea. It's easy. President Trump said that trade wars are good and easy to win. We're not there. We're going to lose this trade war.
Some supporters would say that it's going to benefit the United States economically, and they would point to the economy as it's doing now.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're lucky that we have some headroom built in because the economy is doing well. I think it's holding us back, and there's really no winner here. Our global supply chain, our economy now is so tightly integrated with the rest of the world that when we put up these hurdles, I think other countries are just going to look abroad from the United States for trading partners. They're going to leave us in isolation.
Some Democrats are calling for an end to ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, and that supports deportation of unauthorized immigrants. Where do you stand on that?
I don't support abolishing ICE. I think it's an important law enforcement agency, but this is, I think one of the main failings of this Congress is it hasn't performed its oversight role. There's a lot more to Congress than just what laws do you vote on. You provide oversight and make sure that the money that Congress has authorized is being spent right, and that the law is not exactly being applied right, but that the regulations are being followed and the money is being spent well. ICE is one area that I think we need a lot of oversight. There are many others as well. We need Congress to serve as a check constitutionally, as it's required to do on the other branches.
In a video statement about Russia and whether or not it's been tampering in our elections, you said of your opponent, quote, "He doesn't have the expertise or the energy to focus on what needs to be done." What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that, I teach in the College of Information Sciences and Technology, law and policy courses and technical courses as well. I'm 34 years old. I grew up in this world, and I understand from the ones and zeros on up how the internet works and the kinds of threats that we face. Not only purely technical threats, but the social media and disinformation threats as well. My opponent simply doesn't have that background. Recently, I think he was shocked to discover that we don't have great broadband throughout the district. These are serious problems that I think I think anybody can run for Congress. You don't need to be an expert in any particular area. I think that's important. But I think if you have expertise, it makes you attuned to the gravity of the risks that we're facing. And this is a serious one.
And you said you want to protect Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. In another 20 years or so, Social Security isn't going to have the funding to fully pay for itself if nothing changes. What, if anything, would you support to ensure that it does have the funding?
I think Social Security is a promise that we have made to our future selves and that we've made to the generations that came before us. And so I don't think we can make any reductions in what's been promised, because that's breaking the promise. I think lifting the cap, like we talked about before, is an important step to improve solvency.
And small farms in Pennsylvania are facing a tough market right now and dropping prices, which could lead to the closing of some farms. What do you think Congress should be doing? Yeah,
and there are a lot of farms that are closing. And I went a couple of weeks ago to a dairy farmers crisis hearing that was the farmers themselves put it together, and they wanted to put on the record what they see as the major problems that they're facing and to convey the magnitude of the really despair that they feel closing farms and making it much harder for them to get to make ends meet. So on a short-term basis, I think where the local government or state government or the market fails, that's the role of the federal government. I think the federal government has your back when everything else has gone wrong, when you've done everything right, like most farmers have done, and prices, for example, keep falling. And so I support what a lot of farmers have asked about, which is an emergency price floor. We've done this before in America. $20 per hundredweight of milk. Combine that with longer-term supply management program, because a lot of what we see as driving prices down now is because of oversupply, and there's a number of reasons for that. But if we can help to control supply longer term and help keep the farm open now with a price floor, I think that's an important step.
Do you support what President Trump did renegotiating with Canada on the former North American Free Trade Agreement? And part of that was the market for milk.
Yeah, I think it's global. I'm not too happy when America just decides to up and renegotiate promises that we've made. I think that lowers our standing in the world. This particular deal, my understanding of it is that there aren't huge changes to NAFTA, that there are some things about dairy pricing, for example, and making trade more fair there, but that's just one trading partner of many that we have.
Would you support legalizing marijuana at the federal level? Of course, that's something that states have stepped in and done at the state level, but it's still a narcotic illegal at the federal level.
I do support legalizing marijuana, yeah, and there are a couple of reasons why, but really the main one is what's the reason to have it be illegal? And I just don't see it. I think as a matter of freedom, as a matter of liberty, if there's not a great reason to ban something, then we ought not to.
I think the counter argument would be that marijuana for younger people in particular can be the so-called gateway drug, and it's not good to allow that to get into the hands of young people more easily.
That's just not true. Yeah, I think we have a lot of history to show that.
What about the possibility that if it were more available, that it could be more available to young people too? It's
already fully available to young people. I think it is a sort of a backward-looking approach that we have now. Let's reflect. Let's try to focus on what are the actual problems that we have for young people. I'm more worried about them getting an education, getting a job, staying in Pennsylvania. Marijuana is. it's not the main issue that we're facing. And I think for a lot of people, there's research that's being done into it being as an alternative to opioid painkillers. I don't know what the science will say on that, but I'm glad that people are looking into it.
Would you want to overturn the tax cuts that President Trump signed into law that you were critical of?
I was, and here's why. With the $1.5 trillion, we could have given a check for $5,000 to every American. That would stimulate the economy in a real way. That is somebody who's barely getting by month to month. Their quality of life would markedly improve. If you give $1,000 to, say, a Jeff Bezos, no change whatsoever in the economy. That's real stimulus. That's something that we can do to reward hardworking Americans and to recognize the work that they do. Giving temporary, much smaller cuts to working Americans and much larger permanent cuts to corporations and the wealthiest Americans is not the way to go.
Your opponent has said that he supports term limits, but I've read that you do not support term limits. Why not?
Yeah, I don't. And I'll be honest, this is probably one of the areas that I disagree with a lot of the folks who come to events and when I knock on their doors. I think we have elections every 2 years, and so you can vote the bum out if you don't agree with what he's doing. But the larger issue is, I think, campaign finance reform. That's the bigger problem. That people want to know that they're accountable in some way, and not that the congressman or congresswoman isn't, again, appealing to the interests of out-of-state elites. And I think if we can have campaign finance reform, I've supported overturning Citizens United by constitutional amendment. I think public financing of elections so that elected officials and candidates can spend their time campaigning or governing and not raising funds. I think those are important reforms that would help to, I think, address the same concerns that people have about term limits.
And we talked a little bit about broadband access. Your opponent, Representative Tom Marino, has introduced legislation offering incentives for businesses to invest in broadband to hopefully bring more access across Pennsylvania and the country. Would you support that idea?
I think that's a good small step, but there are a much larger set of problems. And I think the main one is that we just don't have competition. So if you're in, say, State College, you can have Comcast or nothing. That's the choice that you have. This is unlike almost any other consumer choice that we have. If you go to buy toothpaste, it's a dizzying array. But for internet, there's just the one provider. If we enforced our antitrust laws that we already have on the books, if we had competition, I think you would see much lower prices, much higher speeds like in the rest of the world. And then for the folks who don't have service at all right now, where Comcast, it will never be economically feasible for them to, or at least in their view, to run cable to your home. Sure, we can provide some incentives there. I would like to see there be the government actually being the one to provide the cabling and to provide the internet service. I think it's such critical infrastructure in the same way that the founders thought it was so important. They put it in the Constitution to have postal roads and a postal system. I think it's just as important, probably more so today, that we guarantee that everybody have access to the internet.
We have less than a minute left. Voter turnout in midterm elections like this is generally very low. And there was a recent NPR report and poll that enthusiasm among Democrats is sinking. What do you see yourself doing to counter that?
I go around and I just try to say, hey, I'm somebody who thinks that things are broken, and I decided to get involved. And I think people respond to that. And I decided to get involved for my own reasons. And I say that as somebody who's been pretty lucky in life. I can't deny that. And there are big concerns that I have. But I think what I've learned throughout this campaign is that there are people who have much bigger concerns than I do. And they have been beaten down. They have been ground to dust. They have lost all hope for what the government can do for them. They think the American dream is dead. I don't believe that. And I think we have an obligation to make sure that we take care of them. We take care of each other. It starts on November 6th.
Marc Friedenberg, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We've been talking with Marc Friedenberg, the Democratic candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives in the 12th Congressional District. Next, we'll speak with his Republican opponent, Tom Marino. To find out more about the candidate and watch other interviews, go to WPSU.org/vote18. Welcome to WPSU's Vote 18 Race for the 12th District. Today we're talking with Republican Tom Marino, the incumbent in Pennsylvania's new 12th Congressional District. Marino is serving in his 4th term in Congress. Before that, he served as a district attorney and as a United States attorney in Pennsylvania. He recently introduced legislation to provide tax credits to encourage investments in broadband infrastructure in rural areas. Tom Marino, thank you so much for coming in to talk with us.
My pleasure.
So this is a two-part question. Why is broadband access important? And if it is important, is it enough to encourage businesses with tax credits to improve the infrastructure in rural and hard-to-reach areas in Pennsylvania and across the country?
I'll answer the second part of that first. I think it is enough for the tax credits because of how technology is not going to stay where it's at this point. We're going to continue to grow and expand and come up with different ideas. So it's tough to start out a business or businesses to exist or to continue operating. So tax credit for broadband, they will promote that, but mostly because it's so important that we have broadband. I live in the middle of 5 farms, so I know what my farmers go through. And there's believe it or not, a high-tech generation now of younger farmers moving up, taking over the farms and buying farms and larger farms. And they're using their laptops, they're using their pads, they're using their phones to determine where they should be harvesting, how much output of milk the cows are going to produce. And they need access and consistent access and fast access to broadband. And that's the reason I introduced this legislation, and it's bipartisan.
And do you think that a tax credit, though, that will be enough, that it won't require more investment from the government?
Oh, well, when you say investment from the government, I think the government, the taxpayers, we are the government. And so the taxpayers, I think this is their portion of investing. But the private industry, I believe, will invest. Companies already existing will invest, if for no other reason, the competition.
The new 12th Congressional District that you're in includes Mansfield University, Lock Haven University, Penn State University, a lot of institutions of higher education. And you've said that bringing down the cost of tuition should be a priority. What do you think Congress should be doing to address that? Well,
first of all, I'm 25% of my district is new, so I'm getting to know more of it, particularly spending a lot of time in center. And every map I look at, it's different. No, you're farther north, no, you're farther south. So we've come to the conclusion that not so much south, more or less, not so much north, more or less south in center county. So I'm learning a little, the boroughs and townships. But the universities came to me some time ago, particularly Mansfield. And I've had complaints when universities and even high school teachers would come to DC and meet me. We'd have meetings and they'd simply say, we have broadband, it's slow. We don't have broadband, we have it on one side of the building and not the other. So I can't think, other than perhaps in a medical facility, in a hospital, where broadband would be any more important than in our education system. We know, as I just said just a couple of moments ago, you don't see, you never get to a point today without getting on your phone, getting on your GPS, getting on your pad. So the fact that we can have many more courses coming out of a university to someone's home, and not just in the inner city, in the rural areas as well. That will keep the cost of education down. It'll lower the cost of education for those wanting to go back to school. It's important for the university so they can keep doing their research, have the ability for students that are on campus have access to the internet and libraries. This is a movement that I think is a no-brainer.
Do you think that there are other steps that either Congress or the universities themselves should be doing to bring the cost of tuition down?
Most definitely. One of my degrees is in secondary education. I didn't student teach or teach. In secondary education, I taught for a friend of mine, actually my mentor while he was on sabbatical from college. But the government, this is such a large operation nationwide that the government is going to have a role in it and some responsibility for the cost of it. But I still think that the entrepreneurs and businesses, seeing that this is an entire new area to get into, to expand, and see that they can get into this, provide a service, and yet make a profit.
When you were first running for office in 2010 and you challenged the incumbent, a Democrat, to 9 debates, but this time around it seems like you're the one who doesn't want to say yes to the debates. Yeah. Why is that?
Well, first of all, if there's going to be a debate, and I'll make that determination whether there's going to be a debate, not you or anybody else, and I got 1 debate from the Democrats.
When you ran against Chris Carney.
1 debate.
Right, and you asked for 9 debates. Yeah. And this time I've talked to 2 people from League of Women Voters, and one in Lewisburg, one in Center County, and they both said they reached out and that you were not receptive to a debate. No, one debate, if I make my mind up to do that. And the League of Women Voters, they have a little bit to be desired about keeping in the middle of the road as opposed to taking one side or the other. What kind of debate would you like to see?
I usually debate on WVIA, 1 debate on TV.
Why do you think incumbents are more resistant to debates than challengers?
Because some challengers aren't even known. So that's an issue. Others is some may not be prepared. I know my issues, I'm prepared, but again, I will make the decision when I think it's appropriate, whether I'm going to debate.
Well, we'll look for the debate. WPSU asked our readers and listeners for questions, and we got this question from Sherry in Newport. She's part of the new 12th District, and she wants to know, would you support completely eliminating the current cap on Social Security so that all Americans pay Social Security on 100% of their income?
That's an issue that's been in Congress for about 12 years. I've looked at it. I would, under certain circumstances, based on to what extent would it be moved to, or would it be completely eliminated. But the other aspect of that is that's investment money that's going into creating jobs. And we're studying, at least I'm studying, to determine what negative aspect that would have on investments that create jobs.
Because right now there is a cap on your income, your work income, about $127,000. So there are concerns that 20 years down the road that there's not going to be enough funding in Social Security to continue to sustain itself.
Well, I'm starting to disagree with that at this point, because look at all the jobs that this administration is creating. More jobs created, more people are going to be paying into Social Security, paying into taxes, and that's how you generate support and a plan to make sure that Social Security is solvent. It's not by raising taxes, it's not by taking somebody else's money and doing something that the federal government should have done a long time ago. It's job creation. And the jobs that we've created at this point, Republican House, Republican Senate, and President Trump, is off the Richter scale. People have more money on their paychecks. Businesses are surviving because of taxes. They can compete worldwide because now, instead of being the highest corporate tax in the world, we're down there where it's competing. Pensions are up, stock markets are up. This is where we have to go. We have a spending problem.
Traditionally, Republicans have been for smaller government, less spending, fiscal constraint, and you yourself have said that federal spending is out of control. Under President Trump and a Republican Congress, Republican president, spending is slated to continue to go up as a percentage of GDP. What do you think needs to happen if you want to see that change?
Well, spending will go up for a while, but then it will come back down, and it'll come down much lower than it's ever been before. Don't forget, the Obama administration had doubled the debt. He increased the debt more so than every other president put together. So I think the job that President Trump and the Republican House and Senate are doing is a great job. I'm out talking to people all the time, and I've had Democrats come up and saying to me, I like what's going on. There's more money in my wallet. I can afford to hire someone else in my business. So I know there are those that want to make this look bad because their candidate didn't get elected, but this is the best this country's been in for a long time. Unemployment is down below 4%. Minorities, it's at an all-time low. We're looking for people to hire in this country. I just came from a business that said, I can't find enough people to expand my business. So we have to deal with that in the education side of things, but life is getting much better. And I was asked, why would you support Donald Trump? And I asked questions like this of the reporters that were questioning me. Tell me how it's been going the last 30 years with governors and senators and career politicians being president. Where we're 20 trillion in debt, 20 million people out of work, businesses leaving the country in droves, the borders are wide open, I can go on and on.
Do you think President Obama deserves any credit? The unemployment rate, what it was when he took office and what it was when he left office, it was close to 10% and then down much lower than that?
Well, no, I don't, and for this reason. President Obama and his administration manipulated the numbers, manipulated the figures, simply by saying those that were on part-time work were full-time employed. They lowered the actual 40 hours to 30 hours and factored that in as full-time work. So there was a lot of fudging going on there.
How do we know that's not happening now that was going on then?
Because people are employed. We don't have enough people out there to fill the jobs. I don't think I've ever heard that even come close in the Obama administration, where we had a situation where there weren't enough people to fill the jobs.
Your Democratic opponent, Marc Friedenberg, has said that you've done nothing to raise your constituents' quality of life. Can you give a specific example of something you think you have done to raise the quality of life?
You know, that's a typical Democrat socialist view that really doesn't know what's going on. I worked in industry. I know what it's like to get dirt under my fingernails and sweat. I doubt if he knows that. I worked in a factory from 17 until 30, and then at 30 years old, I went to college and law school. My wife worked full-time, I worked part-time, and I wouldn't have been able to do it without my wife. But, you know, in case, and for him being a lawyer, you think he would do a little research. But I kind of thought that question was going to come up, so I have a list of legislation that my office got signed into law.
In the interest of time, is there one that stands out to you?
There are plenty of them, and in the interest of time, we're going to talk about all of them. We're going to talk about the RAPID Act, which streamlines permitting, where it took the government 10 years to give somebody a permit to lay a gas pipeline or to build a housing development, ensuring patient access, which people were not getting their drugs that they needed, particularly the elderly, and those individuals who were terminally ill couldn't get their drugs. Now they are. The Eric Williams corrections officer, where Eric was murdered by an inmate and the guards had no way to protect themselves. Now they are carrying pepper spray because of me, and the violence is down. Transnational drug trafficking, we're going after people who make chemicals that make drugs that are killing and
Congressman, in the interest of time, we're going to have to leave it at that, but thank you.
And one more thing,
okay.
the water gap, Delaware water gap. The federal government at one point said that commercial traffic can't go through the Delaware water gap. So that means that they had to go a circuitous route, more miles, which would cost an increase in the price of their products, more fuel. And we got that law passed that commercial trucks can travel through there. But in the interest of time, I can't go over all the rest that we did.
Thank you. You and other Republicans have been opposed to the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah.
But there is concern now that if it gets rolled back, that people with pre-existing conditions will be left out, that they will not have that guarantee of insurance. What would you say to them?
I support making sure that everyone in this country has health care. If they can't afford it, we in this country have to take care of it. People with pre-existing conditions should not and cannot be prejudiced against because they were born with a disease that they had no control over. I will fight that to the end, and people with pre-existing conditions will have insurance at no greater expense than anyone else.
If people who are young and healthy do not have to get into the insurance pool, how is it fiscally viable to require insurance for people who aren't young and healthy?
Well, that's the problem with Obamacare. Obamacare was supposed to cover 60 million people for $900 billion and some change. And as he was going out of office, I checked to see what the cost would be and who got the health care. It only covered about 22 million at a cost of $2.4 trillion. So the government getting involved always increases. The government doesn't know how to operate situations such as this. What we do have to actually get going is we should be able to cross state lines to get health insurance. That will mean there's more competition. More competition is going to bring the pricing down. I have a piece of legislation right now ready to go to the floor. It's called the CREATES Act. It lowers prescription drugs tremendously because there are pharmaceutical companies out there that don't want to, their patent has expired, but they don't want to release that, and they don't want to sell their formula to generics who can produce the drug at a much lower price because they didn't have to put the research in it. That's another way we can do it. And then plus we have to get the healthcare system and the insurance companies in line to be helping us lowering the cost of healthcare.
In 2016, you issued a press release about legislation to stop children from being held in institutions rather than being adopted. And you said, children have a fundamental right to family. We can no longer sit idly by as children all across the world are forced into institutions and denied a chance to grow up in a nurturing and loving home. With that in mind, what do you think right now of the situation of immigrant children being held in group homes in some cases on the border? So we have immigrant children coming in from Mexico and other places and being held that way.
Well, first of all, over 80% of those children are sent here by their parents ahead of them, thinking that, well, if I get my child in and then I can get into this country even though it's illegally. No. There are people,
be that as it may, though, they're still children.
They're still children, and they're being taken care of, and they're being taken care of much better than they would if their own country. I want to know how worried those parents are who are sending these children with mules, people who are being paid to run these children across a dangerous desert to come into this country. They're being taken care of. They will continue to be taken care of. The Republicans have a plan that they can keeping families together under certain circumstances, as long as the parent isn't a violent individual, isn't a threat to this country. So I've fought for children all my life. I was a prosecutor. I put the bad guys away for rape and incest and murder. My children are adopted. I'm a foster parent. I was a big brother. There's no one out there that's more concerned about children than I am.
The number of children being held in those detention centers, though, is up under President Trump.
Well, that's what the Obama administration is saying. But yes, so it's up because we aren't putting those children out on the streets with illegals that shouldn't be in this country. We're taking the responsibility of protecting those children, making sure they're in a safe environment. That number is going down because we're doing it the right way, not the way the last administration did, is just open the gates and then go where you want to go. These children need to be taken care of, and we Republicans are doing it, and I'm proud of that.
You were sharply criticized for introducing legislation that many have criticized for making it tougher for the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, to crack down on opioid pills and so-called pill mills. And it got to the point where President Trump had nominated you to be the drug czar, and you ended up withdrawing your nomination. What do you say to those critics?
Well, first of all, there were incomplete reports and lies spread by two left-wing unethical news agencies, The Washington Post and 60 Minutes, and it's absolutely not true. I withdrew because this was the Post and 60 Minutes trying to get to President Trump, and he didn't need that grief. But let me tell you what the real situation was there. 60 Minutes ambushed my office when I wasn't even in town and said why they wanted to talk to me, and they knew that Congress wasn't in session until that night. They were supposed to come back because they started getting a little rowdy in my office. They asked to leave. And they were supposed to come back. I waited around. They never did.
Washington Post said that it reached out to you but didn't get a response.
That's right, because I was up for nomination, and anyone up for nomination, as the White House says in any administration, is wait until after your hearing to respond. But let's get back to the legislation.
Is there any truth to that argument? Is there any truth to the argument that the legislation, by raising the bar for what the DEA needs to show?
It didn't. Don't you even read, don't you people in the media even read what the facts are? My legislation was put on the floor because two pharmacists and seniors were calling me saying, we can't get our drugs. And for my terminally ill husband, for my terminally ill mother. The reason why is there was a DEA agent who thought that he interpreted the law, and you don't. So in order to see that the people got their drugs and the law was followed, it's a due process issue. Also, you don't go in and make it shut somebody down unless you have the evidence to do that. And so my legislation, which was approved by the DEA, was sent. Everyone in the House voted for it.
It got bipartisan support. It was signed
No, it's more than bipartisan support. Every Republican in the House, every Democrat in the House voted for it. It went to the Senate. Every Republican, every Democrat in the Senate voted for it. And it was signed into law by President Obama, but my language was changed. I had the very basic language that said, if it's foreseeable, and when that went to the Senate, and look up Orrin Hatch's statements that he made, and did anybody look up? Did you look up in the hearings?
It was looked up it was changed.
In the hearings?
But the initial language in 2014 was significant and present risk. It had been changed from imminent to significant and present risk. Yeah. And the argument is that you raised the standard. And if I could just read a quote from Attorney General Eric Holder said that it would severely undermine a critical component of our efforts to prevent communities and families from falling prey to dangerous drugs.
He's changing his tune because they did approve that language, and it was changed at the behest of the White House and the Attorney General to make it more difficult. My language was very simple, and it hasn't been changed yet today. And when the DEA testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, the acting deputy administrator and the agents said Marino's language was good, we could work with that. The other language, no. And it still hasn't been changed.
The DEA administrative law judge has said that if it had been the intent of Congress to completely eliminate the DEA's ability to ever impose an immediate suspension on this, it would be difficult to conceive a more effective vehicle for achieving.
Well, that's just an administrative law judge who really does not know what he's talking about. He's not a DEA agent. He wasn't a prosecutor. What the situation here was, he just didn't know what he was talking about. He wanted to get his name in a journal at some law school. And even the DEA criticized him for that statement because of a law judge making a statement on an issue that he doesn't know anything about.
Given that's the way the situation is now, are you happy with the way the legislation, the law is now, or do you think anything needs to be tweaked?
I think it should be changed back to my language of foreseeable. And apparently the DEA says, no, we're fine with it. We're working with it the way it is. We have other tools to use. So, look, that was just a hatchet job done by 60 Minutes and the Washington Post through me to get to the president. And that's fake news.
We're moving on to a different topic. In a statement in July about the summit between the United States and Russia, you said Russia is not our ally and their motivations are not based on the promotion of democracy and human rights like the United States. Russia and President Putin cannot be trusted.
Right.
What do you think of President Trump's approach to relations with Russia, and specifically the question of meddling in the elections?
Well, no one wants Russia or anybody else meddling in our elections, especially me. We ought to go after these people like we are. We're prosecuting these people. But President Trump has a fine line to walk. He's got to keep some civility. But he knows, like I know and like many of us know, we can't trust the Russians. We can't trust Putin. He's KGB. This is the guy that killed people. He will do anything he can to undermine the United States and any other country, as you see that they're doing. So, no, I'm still sticking to my guns that we should be having sanctions against Russia and prosecuting those who even attempt to meddle in our election or any other affairs.
Many Pennsylvania farms, small family farms, are struggling with the price of dairy. What, if anything, do you think Congress should be doing to help them?
Just what I did. I dropped legislation that asked that, like the Obama administration had people doing, not allowing whole milk into schools or not wanting whole milk into schools. My legislation says let's put milk whole milk back into schools. It's good for our children, it's good for growth, and we're going to find out that the kids like whole milk more so than the other milk that is in the schools, the milk with less fat. My kids like the whole milk, and this is, it's not mandatory. It's saying to the schools, if you want to, put whole milk back in the schools. Right now the schools are throwing this hundreds of thousands of cartons of skim milk in the garbage. It's not being touched. And in addition to making sure that our children get the vitamins and minerals that they need, this will increase demand. The farmers will be able to sell their milk at a higher price because it's at an all-time low. So it's a real good way to help our farmers. Plus the labeling, companies are labeling products that they say are milk that are not really milk, misleading the public. And plus, as I said, helping our farmers begin drastically expanding access to the internet in the rural areas.
Congressman, we have less than a minute left, but I wonder what your thoughts are on the climate, the political climate in our country right now in Washington, D.C., and even in Pennsylvania. Yeah. It seems like a very divided time. Do you agree with that? And if you do, what do you think is driving that rancor?
It is divided. Well, a lot of it's driving is the extreme left. They don't like the idea that Donald Trump's president, period. And they can't have it their way. They're going to be, they're going to be obstructionists. Look at this, the Democrats on the Senate. And look at Senator Feinstein, had something in her hand that should have been, any value to it should have been handed over to the investigators a month and a half before. No, they had no concern about Ms. Ford. They had no concern about Mr. Kavanaugh. This was just a political power play by the Democrats on the Senate because they don't want a conservative on the Supreme Court. And guess what? The president makes the decisions. The president of the United States makes the decisions on who he or she wants on the Supreme Court. I'm a fiscal conservative. I support Kavanaugh. He's going to be there.
Congressman Tom Marino, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
We've been talking with Congressman Tom Marino, the Republican incumbent and candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives, 12th Congressional District. Earlier, we spoke with his Democratic opponent, Marc Friedenberg. To find out more about the candidates and watch other interviews, go to WPSU.org/vote18.